So a classic acid sound might sound something like this. But the sound design that we're going to do today is going to sound like this. It's time for us to have the talk about FM donks. You're old enough now. I think it's time that you should know. You may have come to believe, rightfully so, that acid synthesizers are at the heart of all donks, of the tastiest donks, that they come from the Roland TB303 synthesizer. And that's a convenient story that we tell to producers who are still, growing up. But in fact, I think we owe it to you now to tell you the truth. I think you can handle it. The tastiest and most disgusting way to actually make donks is with FM synthesis, not with a single sawtooth oscillator as you have believed until now. I know this is going to bring up all sorts of feelings that you don't necessarily know how to deal with, and that's okay. We're going to work through it together. First of all, let's remind you that until now, when I speak about donks, bass sounds like, they would come from something called subtractive synthesis, which is that you take an oscillator and that oscillator is playing a sawtooth wave, which has a lot of frequencies. Then you put that through a filter, and in the filter you cut away those frequencies. But in fact, you do so with a filter that has a lot of resonance, and then you make that filter open up and close in a kind of a wow kind of a movement. And then that creates that nasal donk sound. And then you also use an amplifier to cut away the volume that you don't want. That is how your subtractive synthesizer usually makes these kind of donks. And then inside of a 303, sometimes you also put in some distortion, some overdrive, that kind of audio effect, maybe some delays, whatever. Now you're talking about classic acid, right? But I want to teach you something else. I want to teach you where to go from there. This next level of sound design is inspired by two artists. One is Daniel Avery and one is Kris Wadsworth. These two artists have produced donks that defy the laws of subtractive synthesis. And it's time that you learn how to do it too. Now, FM synthesis is really scary. Nobody teaches you FM synthesis as the first type of synthesis. And that is because, well, it's really freaking freaky. Let me try to explain it to you now. What happens in FM synthesis is that everything starts from one sine wave. That sine wave just produces one tone at a particular frequency. And then what you do is you influence that one frequency, you modulate it by using a different oscillator, a second oscillator, that's going to control the frequency of that first one. And so when you increase the amount of control that happens, you're going to see this happen. So it starts from one frequency, and then we increase how much that second oscillator works, and you see we add all these harmonics. And then when we decrease how much that second oscillator works, we remove all these harmonics. This is beautiful. No filter is involved, but we're going from a dark sound to a bright sound, back to a dark sound. This is exciting in the sense that we don't need a filter to open and close the sound. We can just start from a sine wave and create all these harmonics and back down to nothing. But yeah, Oscar, why would this be relevant and how can we make this compete with acid synthesizers like the 303? Well, we can do a sound design trick here that we cannot do with subtractive synthesis, which is that we can change the relationship between the different oscillators. Usually, the oscillators play either the same frequency or clean multiples of each other. If they're mathematically linked, like one plays double the frequency of the other, you're going to get very clean timbres. But the moment you move slightly away from that, things get really weird. Let me show you in Ableton Live. I'm going to show it to you using Operator. Operator is mostly an FM synthesizer, but it can also work just like a subtractive synthesizer. Here on the left, you've got 4 oscillators. They tend to call them operators in FM synthesis, but that doesn't matter. It's a synonym to oscillators. And we're going to deactivate 3 of them. We're just going to use 1 of them. And what we're doing to make a subtractive synthesizer sound is we're going to be changing the waveform. Because right now the waveform is a sine wave. Just a single frequency playing all the time, right? And we want a different waveform. We're probably going to want something like a saw wave, which has loads of frequencies going up in a very regular pattern all the way up to the top. And then you use a filter to cut away from that till it's dark again. And then what we do is we use an envelope to make that filter open up and close in a shape that's kind of like a wow kind of a shape. So the envelope, we just need to set it over here. And so like that, we create a sound that's a bit plucky. It starts dark, opens up, and then closes again. And if we make that very resonant, we get a wow, wow, wow sound, which is classic for the acid synthesizer. The acid synthesizer, if you then design a nice pattern with a nice step sequencer, you'll get something like this. That's fun, right? However, what we're going to do now is we're going to instead make FM acid. We're going to use a method of synthesis called FM synthesis, and we're going to use it for acid. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove that filter and go back to our sine wave. Start again from 0. That sine wave here playing one frequency. And what we're going to do is we're going to FM this, which means that we're going to create a second oscillator, and the pitch of that second oscillator is going to affect the first one. And that's all we're going to do. So we're going to activate the second oscillator, and then we have to just bring up the volume of that second oscillator. As I bring up the volume here on the left, you're going to see on the right here what happens to the frequency. So it gets brighter until it becomes super bright. Way too much, way too much. But at this level, it looks a little bit like a sawtooth wave. So what we've got is a sound here that's too bright. That's amazing. We could treat it just like in subtractive synthesis and put a filter on there, why not? But in FM synthesis, the way to usually create your sound is you start with a dark sound, just that one sine wave, then you add in this second sine wave, and then you remove it again. So you use no filters, you just use the pure interaction of these two oscillators as the way of going from dark to bright back to dark. So what you do is you put an envelope on this second oscillator to make it more like a pluck, and you start to get something like this. This is pretty cool. So we've got a sound, can go bow just like in a subtractive synthesizer. But now the magic of FM is that you can start looking for different relationships between these two oscillators so that one is not always exactly the same frequency as the other. For example, it could be double the other. This is what this coarse button is. It says, let's make oscillator 2 twice the frequencies of oscillator 1. And that's just going to start messing with the sound in various interesting ways. And this is a space where you can explore without necessarily knowing what's going to sound good. Whoa. I'm exploring. Cool. I can even make the first one half. Nice. Excellent. And so as long as you stay to neat mathematical relationships between those two oscillators, your sound is going to sound pretty nice and bell-like and kind of quite beautiful and hollow. However, once you start going away from that, it starts to get really messy and metallic and dissonant. For example, if you go here, tell me that's not an interesting timbre. Weird as heck. And if you hit 500, 500 is just in between. That's not too bad. That's interesting, right? But the point is that once you start exploring these different relationships, no one really knows what it's going to sound like until you try it out. And that's going to create some of the beautiful textures of FM synthesis. So if we take that previous sound, which was the acid using subtractive synthesis, we get something like this instead, which is FM synthesis. It sounds pure and it sounds hollow to me. And inside that synthesizer, we can now start looking for different relationships, different nuances. Let's see what happens when I go away from the nice relationships. Wow. That's probably not very coherent for music theory, but in terms of sound design, this has attitude. Fun. And of course, we can mess with the envelopes. We can do all sorts of cool things, exploring different riffs here. And the secret ingredient to this part that I'm really excited about is this Phoscyon. I can never pronounce this, this darn synthesizer, but this is the D16's clone of the Roland synthesizer. What's exciting about this is that you can use the internal sequencer, which is a very 303 style sequencer, and export that MIDI here. So all you have to do is make a new MIDI channel, set the MIDI from the Phoscyon, and then select Phoscyon down there. And then you can use this sequencer and you can randomize things. So what would have sounded like this, which is nice, you know, this is nice. This is very workable with some nice drums. But this is something else. This is something interesting and something exciting. And it does have something to do with acid for me, because it is kind of a donk sound, and it is mid-frequency based, so it is inside those speaking frequencies for me. But this technique really allows you to go explore some really interesting relationships between sounds. FM synthesis. And this is all you need to know to get started. 2 oscillators, one modulating the other, and explore the relationships of their different frequencies compared to each other. You can use more oscillators, but it gets more complicated, and 2 is already enough to start finding some really fun sound design. I hope this helps you. If you want to learn in a more structured way from me, if this is a bit too niche for you and you need something more like a curriculum, an actual university level education, go follow one of my courses, the Foundations of Electronic Music or the Foundations Level 2. Come show us on the Discord channel what you did with this. Leave a comment if you know any other artists except Daniel Avery and Kris Wadsworth who use this. And until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care. Bye-bye.